Hello, folks. This is Dr. J, and this is our Dr. J Political Podcast Hour. We're back with Alex here. How you doing, Alex?
Good. Glad to be back.
Yeah, you had a week off. We had Greg Ormond last week, and we're back. We're going to talk some. Supreme Court, the Senate confirmation hearings with Judge Brett Kavanaugh. The confirmation was successful. He was confirmed, approved by the Senate, not on a strictly party line vote. It was 51 to 49. Lisa Murkowski, the Republican senator from Alaska, voted no. Joe Manchin, the Democrat from West Virginia, voted yes. So it was 51-49. He is confirmed. Let's talk a little political fallout here. Where do you see the confirmation? Is the confirmation hearing, the contentious confirmation hearing of Judge Brett Kavanaugh and the ultimate confirmation, is it going to have an effect on the elections in November? And what kind of effect do you think?
You know, I think it will have an effect. I'm not sure how great, but I do believe that, at least as of right now, there seems to be a rallying really on both sides, but mainly I see on the conservative side. So it'll be kind of, in my opinion, interesting to see over the next month what conservatives running for re-election or trying to replace a Democrat incumbent. It'll be kind of interesting to see how they try and keep that momentum going.
Yeah, I've seen conflicting prognostications for sure. I've seen some pundits say that this could mobilize the Democratic and liberal voter base out there and make them more angry to come to the polls and to bring what has been regarded as a blue wave coming in this midterm elections. Of course, midterm elections for the party in government is historically bad news. There's always sort of a check and a rebalance back. So Republicans have already been expecting there to be, although in terms of the people running in the Senate and the number of safe seats for Republicans in the House, this is an uphill battle for Democrats. It's unlikely they're going to get the Senate. They have more contested Senate seats. Democratic Party has more contested Senate seats than the Republican Party. So it's already an uphill battle. I've seen some prognostications say that out of anger, this is going to mobilize the left and the Democratic Party. And I do buy some of that. I'm out of the prediction game. I have retired from predictions after November 2016, as many of us should have. So I try not to make any predictions, but I see some sense in that, in the idea that mobilizing voters is often based on anger. Anger mobilizes voters. Success and wins don't effectively mobilize voters the way that anger does. And so I can see some of that. Although I've seen most of the prognostications come out here lately in the past week or so have been indicating that conservatives are going to find this to be a win, and this might mobilize conservative voters to come to the polls and vote because they got a conservative judge. What do you think?
You know, I agree with you on that, and even more than just the success driving them to continue it, I also saw a lot of anger the way Democrats tried to deny Kavanaugh. I think a lot of them, you know, whether they be right or wrong, a lot of them, you can see an angry base there too. So it'll be kind of interesting to see what happens with that.
When you look at polls throughout the Kavanaugh hearing, Trump supporters hardened their positions and became more approving of Kavanaugh over time. There were a lot of pro-Trump conservative voters, Republican Party voters, who saw this as a liberal identity politics like witch hunt, and so it hardened those voters. We're seeing some effect of this, I think, in North Dakota. Heidi Heitkamp is a Democratic Party senator from North Dakota running a very tight race. She's very moderate. She's pro-life. She follows a lot of sort of moderate Republican policy. Very red state, North Dakota. But she voted no, and it looks like almost immediately the polls are showing that she's now behind, that she's losing support. So some folks are saying that she's losing support among some moderates and maybe some independents who were turned off by the Kavanaugh hearing, precisely what you were talking about. Whereas when you look at Manchin in West Virginia, he voted yes, and it looks like he's holding pretty steady and holding a lead there in West Virginia. So two conservative states. These states are going to have a different kind of, there's going to be a different effect on the voters in those states when it comes to the Kavanaugh hearing. In more liberal states, this might mobilize voters, or more sort of so-called purple states. Now, a lot of people say purple states don't exist anymore. There are still swing states, but even if you look at the swing states, the districts, we increasingly live in liberal neighborhoods if we're liberals and conservative neighborhoods if we're conservative. But at any rate, more swing states, more toss-up states and toss-up races, it might affect things differently. You mentioned a little bit, we were talking briefly about some of the anger that's on the right with regards to what they see as a kind of witch hunt. Donald Trump has come out and now been a little bit more forceful in his attacks on Dr. Ford, the accusations directed at Kavanaugh, and that is playing to his base. We'll see what kind of effect that has. What are your thoughts on that kind of thing?
You know, and it kind of like we talked about off air briefly. I read an article about how maybe all of this gloating and being more harsh on Ford and celebrating the confirmation is kind of, like you said, it's targeting his strong supporters. But myself, kind of being somewhere in the middle, being conservative, not really sure on Trump, it turned me off. It actually turned me off a little bit to kind of see that. And you kind of see that, like I saw it on social media the other day. It's a little bit more divisive than I think he probably intended that to be.
Yeah, I mean, I think some of this is broader, the erosion of civility in our political dialogue and our discourse. Our hyper-partisan world has opened up a much more visceral and explicit level of anger directed at the other side of the aisle. And I think that this is part and parcel of that. And I think this, and it happens on both sides in the sense, we were discussing this, it happens on both sides that we become mobilized and angry over the anger of the other side. And it becomes a kind of tit for tat downward spiral of anger and divisiveness.
When I was, like I mentioned on social media the other day, I was targeted by other conservatives that thought I was crazy. They were calling me names. And just saying some really absurd things because they said it's not worth trying to reach across the aisle anymore. Both sides think it's just ridiculous that both sides are too far gone, that there's no middle ground, and I think that's a real problem right now.
Yeah, it's a major problem, and a serious problem that the consequences of could snowball. And we've already seen violence at rallies and at marches and protests. Our politics have gotten really heated, and in some ways very Manichaean, I think is the word, that we look upon politics with the lens of good and evil. And this sort of Manichaean viewpoint can really snowball. We've lost a bit of civility in our political community. And I think that was partly the call that Jeff Flake, senator from Arizona, had made in that very dramatic moment when the committee was going to vote to approve the Kavanaugh nomination. He said that, in effect, that he would vote yes to move it forward past the committee, but that he's calling for a 1-week delay on the floor vote and an FBI investigation. I think he didn't come out and explicitly say it, but I think it was a clear understanding that his vote on the floor wasn't going to be there without a week delay and an FBI hearing and some insinuation that other moderate Republicans and maybe some moderate Democrats had felt the same way. I think part of what he was genuinely attempting to do, because I know Jeff Flake. I've read his book. He's written a book about conservatism. He cares a lot about American politics and the political community. He cares a lot about the kind of civility of our political discourse. I think he genuinely felt that this was an attempt to kind of try to bring the Senate together and in some ways by proxy sort of bring the country together as well, that he had seen the country being torn apart by this. I don't think that was very effective, though, I must say. I don't think that really worked out. And I think that there were two strategies at play. The moment that he decided to do this, suddenly liberals and Democrats and sort of anti-Kavanaugh forces thought that this was an opening. They thought that now the confirmation is in doubt, more information might be released, who knows, the FBI investigation might uncover something, et cetera, and that his chances of confirmation were now less. I did not see that. I thought that this was strategic for Republicans and moderate Republicans in particular, but pro-Kavanaugh forces and Judge Kavanaugh. I thought that this was a strategic win for them because it would allow them to have a week delay and an FBI investigation. I didn't think the FBI investigation was going to uncover anything new or anything conclusive, and that it would allow them to effectively say, look, we followed the process. we had an FBI investigation, now let's vote yes. And would allow even moderate Democrats to say yes as well. And indeed one did, Joe Manchin. So, my thought when that happened, when I was first watching Senator Flake do that, I think that turned out to be right. And I don't think it's really sort of bridged any or healed any of the gap. In fact, as we go in now, we're right in the thick of the season. Voting has already begun for the midterm elections. I think that this is going to remain a sore point of divisiveness on both sides, the anger and the hurt, and it's very unfortunate, I think. So do you, on the more general sort of notion of the midterm election outcomes, you think it's going to have an effect? Do you side one way or another that it's going to have a better effect for Republicans as opposed to Democrats, or?
I do believe that the Kavanaugh thing will end up being a more positive influence on the election for the conservatives. Will it be enough to kind of stop the momentum that the Democratic Party's kind of had coming into the election? I'm not sure. I don't like to make predictions about that either. But I do think there will be a positive influence, and I think we'll see it.
Or keep the House for Republicans, which I think is unlikely. I think that the Republicans are going to lose the House. I think they very well might keep the Senate. Yeah, I mean, I think I come down on the other side a little bit. I think that especially as if the rhetoric heats up and if Trump continues to rally on this, and if he continues to attack Dr. Ford or tie this, more broadly speaking, to anything that especially women voters see as central issues and concerns, I think there's going to be a backlash. I think that there is going to be mobilization and some momentum on the Democratic Party, but we'll see how that plays out.
I could see that. It's, in my opinion, I don't think he will continue to press as hard as we get further away from it. I won't press as hard at Dr. Ford, and that's kind of where I see the momentum kind of keeping up for conservatives and kind of maybe not so much for liberals. But I definitely see your point. If he keeps pressing hard on that, I could see it going your way as well.
So it's a question of keeping Trump in check and keeping Trump from his own instincts,
that could go a long ways come November.
Yeah, and a mixed record on that in the past. We'll find out if that actually happens. Where do you see the Supreme Court going from here?
You know, I kind of read up on it a little bit. You know, he had his first hearing today, and you know, I think it was a lot more calm and kind of procedural than people thought it was initially maybe going to be. You know, there weren't protesters out in front like there was during the hearings and the confirmation. So I kind of see it proceeding along more normal lines than any drastic changes at this point.
Yeah. Do you see now a lot of folks are saying, rightfully so, that the court is now shifting more to the right, more to a conservative viewpoint on specific issues? Do you think that there are going to be some real fundamental changes? And we can begin with maybe just the issue of abortion, which has really been front and center, the kind of elephant in the room in a lot of ways throughout the Kavanaugh confirmation hearings.
It's kind of been a tricky one for me because when you look at more recently at Kavanaugh, you see his conservative side, and you would think maybe that would get overturned. But I did a little bit of research into kind of the past rulings that he's been a part of, and he's actually ruled abortion legal a few different times throughout his career. So
upheld the Roe precedent, yeah.
So it'll be kind of interesting to see. I'm not really sure where he's at right now, but I don't know. I don't see it probably changing.
I do think that the political calculations are actually harder than the context and the situation, the environment of the Supreme Court itself. I think that the Supreme Court, the way it's composed right now, the way the court is composed, it's conservative enough that it's conceivable they could overturn Roe v. Wade. But the political calculations are very real and very, very pronounced. What I mean by that is if Roe is actually overturned, you are going to see a wave in this country, a political wave. That is going to move in the other direction, and it will be a lightning rod for perhaps even a generation of politically mobilized voters. And so we've actually seen this happen in other countries in terms of Ireland and the abortion issue, and how the abortion issue became a real spark for pro-choice forces in Ireland. So we'll find out how that works. How about another issue, throwing out another issue? And I think an issue, one of the key issues, perhaps one of the most important political issues and often overlooked, the notion, the concept of corporate personhood, the Citizens United case. The Citizens United case effectively says that corporations are people and that money is speech. And that because money is speech, money cannot be regulated in any way differently than First Amendment regulations for speech when it comes to electoral politics. That has been a very important and impactful issue. It is an issue, I think, that there is a lot of concern amongst both the liberals and conservatives. I know a lot of conservatives who are not happy with corporate personhood and would like to see Citizens United be changed, as well as liberals. Do you see that issue do you see Citizens United perhaps being overturned and Kavanaugh being elevated to the Supreme Court? Is that going to change anything or move anything in one direction or another, do you think?
I haven't really heard a lot about that.
Mm-hmm.
So from what you kind of just explained, probably not, in my opinion, but maybe you have a different opinion.
Well, I think that we are much less likely, with Kavanaugh on the court and with a more conservative court, I think we are less likely to overturn Citizens United. And I think, in fact, subsequent rulings on campaign finance, on electoral politics broadly, will generally favor corporate interests and special interests above the interests of the average American voter. And I'm not saying that that's a core conservative issue. I just think that it's less likely under conservative political leadership that those things are going to be overturned. I could be wrong about that, but that's kind of my own thought about it. Any other issues that you see out there that might be affected by a changing composition of the court?
I think the Second Amendment and gun control, I think that liberals that want more gun control, more regulations, I think that took a big hit with Kavanaugh being confirmed. I don't see much happening there at this point in time now with Kavanaugh being part of the Supreme Court.
Certainly, and I think that the politics of the Second Amendment and how it has mobilized a lot of liberal voters, but not just liberals, independents as well, and even some conservatives. Studies show in polls that a number of conservatives support something like comprehensive regulation of firearms or reasonable regulation, or however you want to describe, background checks, longer waiting periods, more difficulty obtaining firearms if you have a history of mental illness, et cetera, et cetera. That those who are mobilized over that issue, in part because of the mass shooting phenomenon that we see in society, school shootings and mass shootings that seem to be on the increase. I think a lot of those voters and a lot of those activists are going to look instead to the legislature and to the executive for some kind of change. Now, out of the Parkland shootings in Florida out of the Las Vegas shooting, it was a bump stock device or mechanism that allowed a rapid fire of this firearm in the shooting. There were calls. President Trump made a call to potentially ban bump stocks. Congress has toyed with the idea. I don't think the courts are going to deal with that. I think that's going to be about passing laws that prohibit certain kinds of firearms or certain kinds of accessories to firearms, or perhaps even executive orders along those lines. Do you see that the same way, or?
I do. I kind of see it how you see it. I don't think the courts will probably do much, and I think that's kind of goes back to the midterm election, getting the legislature maybe more liberal come November, so that they have a way to maybe push that agenda a little bit more, with the court now kind of leaning more conservative. Yeah,
and I think I think the D.C. v. Heller case, the most important Supreme Court case dealing with the Second Amendment from 2008, and Justice Antonin Scalia's majority decision in D.C. Heller, it's going to be very hard to overturn. That sets a very powerful precedent. Scalia put his life's work into that decision, and it's a very thorough majority decision. I think that there is some wiggle room in the sense of how he interprets U.S. v. Miller from the 1930s, the Supreme Court case dealing with shotguns, and basically saying that Heller does not overturn, his majority decision does not overturn U.S. v. Miller. There's still a role for regulating firearms, but that role is limited by the Heller decision. I think that there is not a lot of room. There's not a lot of wiggle room to either overturn or for the courts to pass anything like some kind of constitutional sanction of the regulation of firearms in this country. It's going to have to be through Congress. It's going to have to be an act of law through Congress, or perhaps an executive order. But we all know executive orders. They're like tying your shoes, right? You can tie your shoes, but then you can untie them on a moment's notice. And that's an executive order, right? They can be untied, they can be unmade in a heartbeat. Other issues that you find percolating in the court, key issues here. One that comes to mind, the role, sexual orientation. The right of employers to refuse service to, for example, gay married couples. This is the Masterpiece Cake decision. The Supreme Court effectively kind of punted the issue, kind of tried to negotiate a middle ground there, sided with the Baker, but did so under very limited grounds. Do you see that? Do you see the issue maybe of gay marriage, of sexual orientation, of LGBTQ rights, those kinds of things shifting more to the conservative side because of the makeup of the court?
Maybe I don't think their rights will probably shift, but like the Baker case that you mentioned, I don't see rulings coming against the Baker in that instance.
Mm-hmm.
The right to refuse service and all that. I don't see that changing. But as far as rights of the LGBTQ community go, I don't see much change in there.
Some observers have said that the Masterpiece Cake case has opened up now new ground for folks to argue that employers could refuse the right of service based on race or ethnicity. Are we going that far in that direction, do you think?
I think that's maybe a little bit of an exaggeration. I don't see it going that far.
Mm-hmm. There is strong precedent that such refusals are clear cases of discrimination. But we'll see where that goes. That seems to be moving fairly far to the conservative to perhaps a conservative position on that. Let's talk a little Kansas politics. The talk of Kavanaugh, which has been raging in the national media, hasn't gotten a lot of play in Kansas. And Kansas politics, the race for governorship, we had Greg Orman here last week. They haven't really touched, none of the candidates have really touched upon that, of course. And the office of a governorship of Kansas, it's not like they can do very much, of course, but national issues are not always the same as what happens at the local and the state level. What were your thoughts about Orman's visit here last week and his response to some of the questions?
Yeah, I didn't really know much about him coming in, so it was kind of more of a learning thing for me, anything listening to him speak, than it was kind of just confirming his beliefs. I think he makes a very interesting case for, talking about voting Republican because you're scared that a Democrat will win, and how voting scared is not the right way to vote. And I agree with him on that one. And I'm intrigued to see how many votes he ends up getting when it comes to November.
Yeah, he's polling. Some polls suggest single digits, others a little higher. Orman disagrees. He thinks he's doing a lot better than what the polls may suggest. He just wrapped up a big statewide tour. That's why he was here in Hayes. One of the key questions, I think, is who is he going to peel voters from? From Kobach, from Republicans, or from Laura Kelly and the Democrats? Are moderate Republicans going to be more likely to vote for Orman, or are moderate Democrats more likely to? Who is he going to hurt more, Kelly or Kobach? Who do you think?
Right now, I think it would have to be Kobach, in my opinion. But as you said, he hasn't really touched on Kavanaugh. Not any of them really have. But you saw last weekend Trump came to Topeka and campaigned for Kobach. So although maybe he hasn't come out and said anything that could kind of show his stance on what he believes in Kavanaugh. So maybe if Orman comes out and says something more liberal or conservative on that point before November, maybe that could change, but as of right now, I kind of see him taking more away from Kobach than Kelly.
I agree, 100%. I think that if Collier had won the nomination, the Republican Party nomination for governor, the current governor of Kansas, Collier, I think then it would have been up for debate. And I think that it would have, we would have been in a different context, in a different environment, and Laura Kelly could have been more damaged by Orman's campaign than Collier. But I think the place that Kobach is in, and his platform and his particular vision and perspective, it can potentially turn off a lot of moderate Republican voters who still have a bad taste in their mouth from the Brownback experiment. And those very moderate Republicans who came out and pushed back against the Brownback regime, those are voters that might either stay home, they might go to Orman, but I think it's likely that Orman represents a kind of pragmatic, somewhat centrist middle that will appeal to a lot of those Republican Party moderate Kansan voters. So anything to add on that point?
No, I think you got it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's where we're at right now. We'll see. It's going to be very interesting when we get to November. We're going to see the results. And right now, Kelly and Kobach are running neck and neck. Orman is in third place, but he makes a really interesting case. I presented him with a somewhat difficult question. I thought he handled it really well. The question of the structural role this has to play in terms of our two dominant parties. There's a lot of literature built up here that suggests there's a reason why we have two dominant parties and why the American political system, looking back into history, have always had a kind of equilibrium of two dominant parties. And that's the basic structure of our electoral system. It's a majoritarian winner-take-all system. We don't have a proportional representation system. 15% of the vote does not translate into roughly 15% of the power in government. 15% of the vote means you lost. You didn't win anything. 51% of the vote against 49% of the vote, you win 100% of the power. You can get 49% of the vote, you can get millions of votes, and you get 0% of the power in a majoritarian winner-take-all election. And this really does mean that in such an environment, there's little chance we're going to have any durable third-party movement over time, that it will extend beyond just a single individual like Ross Perot or another third-party, any other third-party candidate, that there might be a viable change. Unless, and this is something that he didn't really touch upon, but it could be that his approach is really a substantive understanding of a gap that exists in our party politics today, and he maybe is opening up ground for potentially what might look like a new party in a different two-party system. Now, that's some ways hard to envision. What are your thoughts on that? Do you think that there is really a substantive vision here that Orman presents, or is he really just kind of an entrepreneur and a strategist, and he's sort of trying to negotiate somewhere in the middle of a hyper-polarized world and providing a centrist position?
I think it's more of just providing a centrist position for the people that are currently too scared, if they're liberal, to go too far left, or if they're conservative, to go too far right. And they don't want to kind of be caught up. You kind of saw it with some people in the Trump campaign in 2016. They didn't want to vote for him. I know my dad came out and said this. He's a conservative. He didn't vote for Trump because he didn't want to be responsible for some far right activity that could potentially happen. And I kind of see that, kind of what Orman's doing in Kansas a little bit, trying to target the people that don't want another Brownback experience, but also people that don't want to go maybe too far left either.
Much remains to be seen in November. It's going to be a very interesting election indeed. Another very good conversation here. I want to give a shout out to Sarah. How you doing? Good times, Alex. And next week we're going to come back. We're going to talk some more politics, different issues, different time, but a real pleasure. Thanks, Alex.
Yep. Good to be back.
All right. Take care, folks, and have a great week.